Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, as an update from last week, the trade show in Italy that I mentioned that had written me on Monday to see about having me record because they didn't think they could do social distancing in their in-show theaters, a day later canceled the show till 2021. So the entire thing will be virtual. So they do need me to do the piece, but they don't expect people to get on planes, fly in from all over the world, attend a trade show, etc. So that's nice. There's only one significant trade show left in my industry for this year that hasn't canceled yet. And I assume they will shortly. And the stuff is all just basically contract related and insurance coverage dictated, but no one's meeting in person for quite a while. Anyway, that's just as far as updates go. As far as really neat stuff in my life goes, as I've talked about for the last few weeks, I sent out my first issue of my zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, to past guests of the show, supporters, friends, etc. Just to share, I guess. It's nice. I've been getting postcards and mail from people who've read the zine, enjoyed it, told me about stuff they liked and or didn't like. But I was completely unprepared for one of my guests, the great book reviewer Michael Durda, to write about Haiku for Business Travelers in the Washington Post last week. It came in as a Google News alert. The joke was, when I first saw my name show up in the news alert, I thought it was just the same thing as the day before, where comments of mine showed up in Bioprocess International related to manufacturing capacity for COVID-19 therapeutics. In fact, it was not related to that. Instead, it was Michael's 3 R's of a critic's vacation: rest, relaxation, and reading. I will, of course, now read you the paragraph in question. Last week, the mail brought Haiku for Business Travelers, a slender volume of, quote, writing, photography, conversation. In it, the versatile Gil Roth prints some of his poems and mini-essays, but half the book consists of extracts from an interview with the late poet and editor J.D. McClatchy. I knew McClatchy a bit, and we shared an enthusiasm for the remarkable and now somewhat underrated Thornton Wilder. Roth himself is the host of the Virtual Memories Show, a weekly podcast in which he entices creative folks to talk about their work as novelists, literary scholars, or comic book artists. He's even interviewed a few journalists, among them one who reviews books each Thursday in these pages. So, I had long felt that the first mention I would ever get in the Washington Post would somehow be a lobbying-related felony or something that I inadvertently committed. So I'm very happy to get this out of the way, be mentioned in the Washington Post in a way that calls me versatile, which is something. Anyway, if you're interested in reading Haiku for Business Travelers, hit me up. You can get my email through the website here. You can go to haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and drop me some info that way. It's free. You can kick in a few bucks if you want to for production, postage, or the misguided belief that my writing has some sort of monetary value to it. Now, sort of speaking of that, this week's guest is Zena Hitz, the author of the wonderful new book, Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life, from Princeton University Press. Lost in Thought begins with Zena's story of disillusionment with high-powered academia, and then evolves into this exploration of why the best life is one that pursues learning for its own sake. And this is a podcast that I used to refer to as being about books and life, not necessarily in that order. So I'm simplifying things. Zena draws in examples from antiquity up through the present moment, like from the Greeks to Augustine to Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, all to examine how we live our lives and what we owe others and what we owe ourselves in relation to learning and books. It's really a masterful piece of work, and the sort that articulates what I try to do with my life and this show. Because her central argument is that we shouldn't be pursuing learning and books with an aim to some material goal, even something like social justice. It doesn't say don't pursue learning in a specific field, but what she characterizes as an intellectual life isn't something that should have a fixed or material end or goal in mind. And she doesn't say those goals aren't worth pursuing, but that they can sort of corrupt the essence of intellectual thought and learning. She makes the argument better than I do, of course. I mean, I've talked about like the benefits in my day-to-day life that came from doing this podcast in terms of public speaking, confidence with meeting new people, et cetera. But I've also grown richer within by just opening myself to all the reading and the other voices and the questions that come through conversation. Now, Zena is a tutor at St. John's College, and she and I overlapped there in the early 90s. I was in the Graduate Institute while she was an undergrad. We didn't really know each other, but when I saw that she had this book coming out, I figured I'd push the Annapolis connection and try to get her on. Turns out she was quite willing and loves talking about her book and all the other books that feed into it, including one of our shared favorites, The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. Anyway, Lost in Thought is an excellent read, and it's got a blurb from one of my favorite podcasts, Alberto Manguel, who wrote, "Lost in Thought is a moving declaration of faith in the intellectual act at a time when everything we do seems to conspire against it." I will note, in keeping with what Alberto said about faith, and as Zena talks about elsewhere, there's a certain Catholicness, as opposed to Catholicity, in Zena's notion of the world, the immanent world and the transcendent one, to use Walker Percy's terminology. But it's not overwhelming or doctrinaire. And what she lays out in the book certainly doesn't preclude another religious or irreligious or atheistic approach to books and life. Now, as caveats go, the gain on her mic is a little high, but that's better than too low. Also, we spend more time talking about St. John's than we do about Lost in Thought, which is my bad. But I really enjoy talking with someone who shares so many experiences with the books and the college. So there you are. Now here's Zena's bio from Lost in Thought. Zena Hitz is a tutor in the Great Books program at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. She has a Ph.D. in ancient philosophy from Princeton University and studies and teaches across the liberal arts. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Zena Hitz. As an opening question, what is virtue and can it be taught? I'm just kidding.
Well, it's funny you should ask that because no.
Yeah. No, really. Let's just start with Lost in Thought and where it began for you and where you thought you were starting and the book you ended up with and where we are now.
Right. So it started, as I relate in my preface, I was an undergraduate at St. John's, where we're both alumni, which is a very much learning for its own sake sort of a place. And then I went to graduate school in sort of more or less high-powered elite research institutions. And I learned a lot, and it was wonderful in many ways. But over time, teaching in research universities, I felt something was off and that I wasn't doing the kind of work that I had thought I would be doing. And then especially I wasn't passing on to young people the kind of education that I'd had myself. So anyway, I got very fed up with the profession. I spent 3 years, I quit. I spent 3 years living in a religious community in remote Canada. And while I was there, I thought a lot about my experiences and which ones had really mattered to me. And I thought about the academy, and I thought about what worked and what didn't. And I thought about what really mattered about intellectual activity. And so when I discerned out of the community and decided to come back to St. John's, I found I had lots of thoughts about what a university was for, what had been wrong about my previous experiences, what was right about what I was doing being back at St. John's. And at that time, I was also reading about the crisis of the humanities, which was a big topic back in 2015, 2016, which is when this was. So, and nothing sounded right. It was, Silicon Valley loves philosophy majors. That was the kind of the level that we were getting. Yeah. And I didn't think that captured why I loved the work I did and why everyone else I knew did. So I wanted to try to capture that. So anyway, I wrote an essay. The essay was published online, and then the editor at Princeton invited me to write a book. So I wrote a book, not quite knowing what I was doing. And I was worried at several points that it would end up not being quite coherent, that it would end up being just a collection of my favorite thoughts and favorite stories. But thanks be to God, I think that it's reaching people who have felt, as I felt, that there's something wrong with higher education and that it isn't a quick fix. It's a matter of fundamentals. And so I'm very grateful that the book's getting the reception that it's getting, and happy to keep talking about it with people who are interested in it.
Again, when I saw the book title and the fact that I'm pretty sure she was an undergrad when I was at St. John's, I figured that's a perfect connection. Before we get to the corruption, I guess, of higher ed into the degraded state it's in, what did you think the purpose of college was when you were deciding where to go, when you were finishing high school?
Oh, that's a funny question. I never thought about it. It was just not something I thought about.
And that's what I'm wondering.
It was not so part of what I remember, and when I say this, I think in the book, I had no anxiety about it, and I was under no pressure. So I had a kind of dramatic love story with St. John's. I was there for the summer with a program for high school students after my junior year. And as soon as I set foot on campus, I knew this was the place for me. So I applied actually to become a freshman in the fall and skipped my senior year of high school. And, I never regretted it. I knew it when I saw it. I knew that it was what I wanted. And my parents resisted my leaving early, but they never gave me any flack for wanting to study philosophy or literature or the liberal arts. Whereas I think kids today really struggle with their parents if this is what they want to study, because the parents are anxious that this won't prepare them for the world. So it really is a different environment, I think, than the one I grew up in, even though I don't feel so old, but I must be if it's changed this much.
Well, my very first semester undergrad, now I spent most of my undergrad at Hampshire College, but very first semester, the anti-St. John's. And trust me, we could go into that too.
No, that's where I would have gone. That was where I was leaning towards before I set foot on St. John's. So that's funny that you went there.
Everybody had Hampshire, Evergreen, and Oberlin, or St. John's. Right. They were, either this or one of those three. Right. But when I was at Tulane, there was a kid I met who, what's your major? Chemical engineering. Oh, did you have a thing for that in high school? No, it has the highest starting salary of any major. And this was 1989.
Oh, wow.
That was the mentality. I'll go into
He was
this field I know nothing about.
Ahead of his time.
Yeah, but the idea that we treat education as though it's literally, an investment that needs a return. I guess I'm answering your question about where the corruption of academia began. That's kind of horrifying.
And I think the tragedy of that too is that the students who I was a student with, so the undergrads who were there when you were a grad student, and also many of your fellow grad students, went on to be extremely successful. So, in all walks of life, all kinds of professions, I'm shocked sometimes to notice it. So I don't think success is the right metric. I don't think it's the reason for an education. But I also think that it's a false dichotomy that unfortunately has persuaded a generation of parents and kids that somehow if they like something, it will never help them in the world. And if they don't like something, it'll be sure to make them tons of money and give them the stability that they need to succeed.
Yeah. And how did and this will sound kind of parochial, I guess. How did your parents deal when you were going through the odyssey that you went through post St. John's? Seeing the I guess the highs and lows, or just the choices you had to make before you ended up finding really where you wanted to be. And I know you portray them as a very, we'll say hippie-ish parents.
I would say that's true.
Okay.
They always gave me a lot of independence. If I had a complaint, I would have said a bit too much. So I was always free to live my life as I saw fit. And I was always by nature a bit adventurous, and I think they always understood that. So I think that, I guess I don't, for that reason, I don't really quite answer that question. They have always trusted me to make my own decisions, and have tolerated my adventurous ways. So I'm grateful for that.
Cool. Now, have you been getting feedback from conventional academia? It's one thing to hear from St. John's types, but has the book been, I know it's only been out a few months, but have you been hearing from people?
I've had a really very positive response, and from many conventional academics, and in a way that started even before the book was out. Even when because I was in conventional academia for a long time, I still have many friends and connections, and I would see them and I would tell them what I was working on. And, I think over the years, many academics have been worn down by the current culture. And I think a lot of it really resonates with them. And I think people feel, as in other professions right now, people feel powerless. They feel like they don't have the power to shift their institutions towards their values. And I can understand why, because it is really daunting and it's not always clear what you can do. But on the whole, people who become academics, there's something that they loved about learning that got them into it. And so they appreciate the book for that reason. I've gotten no pushback yet. We'll see. We'll see what happens as the months go by. But.
Yeah. And as everybody's adjusting to a completely different framework for teaching, learning, et cetera. In fact, let's just dive over to that question now. You've had half a semester of St. John's in the pandemic age. How is seminar, et cetera, by Zoom? How does that work in comparison to everybody sitting at a table?
Well, it's funny. I viewed the prospect, as I think most of my colleagues did, with complete dread. We're such an in-person, on-campus institution. And of course, we all felt very much for the seniors who missed out on all of the customs and rituals of the last part of their senior year. And it's definitely not Zoom classes, as everyone, I think, acknowledges, if they're being honest about it, it is definitely a step down. It is not as good as in-person education. But I also want to really honor my students who, I was teaching all juniors for one thing. So students who were a little more mature, who had already taken in a lot of the mentoring we give our students in person, and were able to make adjustments for an emergency. I was teaching junior math, which is based in the second semester on Newton's Principia, which I will say so far, absolutely the hardest book at St. John's that I've ever read. We read tons of extremely difficult books. I mean, Aristotle's Metaphysics, The Critique of Pure Reason, Apollonius, conic sections, lots and lots of hard books. This takes the cake. And I was really not sure how, without a campus community, my students would be able to really dig into it, without that kind of support and the pressure of other students. And they really rose to the occasion. I had a Google Doc where they wrote the class letters. They wrote letters to one another, and they had some very interesting thoughts and delved into details as they could. And really, I think we had good conversations. So the tutorials, I thought when there was a bit of concrete material, I thought the Zoom class worked a bit better. I actually thought this is my own personal opinion, not everyone had it, but sure. I thought that the seminar, the St. John style seminar, was a bit more difficult because if you remember St. John's seminar, it relies very much on the energy of the students, the spontaneity of the students. There's often silences, there's often changes of direction. And I found the lack of energy that happens on a Zoom seminar to really make things difficult. That said, my seminar students came through. We had very good Adam Smith seminars, which are normally when students start to zone out. So they really rose to the occasion. But I do think it's hard to have an open-ended, spontaneous conversation when all you have is a screen. I think that's really hard.
That's what I was telling you before we started recording for real is, I always do these in person. So
right.
Not seeing the other person and being able to read them, across a table, it's been a weird adjustment for me. I'm dealing, but it's still second best.
Well, there are so many things that can happen in a classroom in person that can't happen online. So you for instance, as the tutor, as what we call our professors, when I see someone who's trying to talk, I see them across the room trying to get into the conversation, and I can say, "Oh, weren't you trying to get into the conversation?" I can't see that on the screen, and I can't respond to it. And so little things like that really make a difference. Although I think for me, the real challenge was just the energy. There's something about being in a room with people that just gets you going and gives you the power and the excitement to do really difficult work. Anyway, yeah, it's hard. It's going to be hard if we have to stay online, especially with students who are newer and haven't been trained as well in the way we do things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been from the other academics I've interviewed since the pandemic began. It's been it was okay this semester because we knew each other.
Yeah.
We could at least understand each other's rhythms, but new students, they're dreading this fall.
Oh yeah.
How to build that dynamic, out of nothing. How
to get to know someone over Zoom. I mean, that's a very hard thing. We'll see what happens. We'll learn. And I hope what we'll learn is the truth, which is that, gosh, we need each other in person. As soon as it's safe to gather in person, let's do that.
That's been my biggest thing is just, my wife early on was like, so what do you really want to do or where do you want to go? I'm like, I just want to sit across a table from someone with a couple of microphones and talk. I know it sounds terrible. This is my Diogenes thing, He's got the lantern. I've got a couple of microphones. But yeah, just that feeling free to sit down with somebody and talk. Yeah, it's Well, it's a weird thing because early on, for the first 3 months, I was doing almost daily check-in podcasts with past guests.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, I stopped that and I started going back to this format, which is new people with new books or just people I haven't spoken to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it was, after 3 months or so, we have changed in ways we no longer quite get.
Yeah.
Who we were before that.
Yeah.
Or at least it's become more subtle in its weirdness as to how we're changing. I guess along those lines, and I know launching Lost in Thought has been, tied into this process, but what have you found to be surprisingly essential or inessential besides the in-person connection? And it's not necessarily just with tutoring, but within your life as the past few months have gone by, what are you surprised matters and doesn't matter so much?
Oh, that's a really great question. It might take me a minute to get my teeth sunk all the way into it. So with tutoring, it's definitely, in terms of our college, I've talked some about the classroom, but as you know from being at St. John's, we very much have a campus community, and that involves all kinds of things, chance run-ins with people that you haven't seen, whether that's students or colleagues, conversations in the hallways. Those things, in a way, I miss more than anything. That's also true, I think, for ordinary life. The sort of casual interaction really matters. It's a burden to have everything be done with real intention. Who would I like to see? Who would I like to talk to? Is it safe? When can I do it? When can I not do it? So I that's what I feel like the biggest loss has been. The everyday, casual, unplanned human interaction. That's I think the loss I've felt the most. That and
what turned out not to matter? Sorry.
I was also going to say, I think the bigger thing, maybe even than that, that's all the quarantine. I mean, the economic situation I find very scary. So I've been forced to live in the moment and stop thinking about the future out of sheer psychological necessity. But what has turned out not to matter? That's a hard question. I'm still attached to my old ways of doing things. Well, I'll say what I've liked, and maybe that'll help me get to what turned out not to matter. I like many middle class people stuck in my house. I have gotten more domestic in a good way. So I'm gardening more, I'm growing food, I'm baking bread, I'm using the food in my fridge. So there's something about that. And, things around the house become more important when that's basically the only place you are. There's something about that I really have enjoyed and that I actually kind of hope lasts past the crisis. Because that is actually something balancing. So it's taken the edge off the hectic pace of life and allowed me to focus on some other things. That's still not quite an answer to your question, what turned out not to matter, but it's something. It's something that I think is positive anyway.
Well, I'm sure just like a seminar, we'll come back to this in like 45 minutes. It'll suddenly hit you that, I was thinking. And...
Right.
I always tell people this is a conversation. No one knows what I mean by that. They all think it's an interview, but rarely does someone realize. Yeah, rarely people realize, I can ask him stuff too, and we can interact. But it's cool. Most people understand the format is the format. But yeah.
Right. Well, how can I ask you how you would answer the question? So what have you found didn't matter?
It's weird because the things that did matter. I'll tell you something. I tend to get by without much in-person interaction in the world, but I realized, doing those daily check-in podcasts was very useful for me because otherwise, my household is me, my wife, and our dog, and he doesn't talk much, so it's really just our in-person thing.
Yeah.
And I found when I started reaching out to past guests, people who I knew or at least had one conversation with, those conversations really helped. They got that person out of their day-to-day cocoon. They got me out of mine. The thing that weirdly I missed, the running group I was in, I'm in northern New Jersey, and we were second hardest hit state until California blew past us. And I run with these two men who are 20 years older than me, so around 70, and a couple of other pals of theirs, 2 towns over from me, and couldn't do that for a couple of months. One of them kept the group going, quote unquote, social distancing, but the other guy and I were both like, no, that's not feasible. We can't do that. Yeah. And recently, as the numbers really went down in New Jersey, we started doing that again, and getting out and doing stuff. The funny thing, last week at this time, actually, I was doing a business webinar with Duke University for my day job, and I actually put on a full suit and shirt and everything and pants to do the video thing. But I'm known throughout my industry and even among my podcast guests as that guy who dresses really, really well. And the last couple of months, I get up in the morning, I look at a closet full of suits and shirts and all that stuff, and I think, I don't need any of this. I've been wearing, outside of that webinar, it's been shorts and running gear since March. That's it. I realized all that stuff that I still love, the nice jackets and suits, and someday I will wear those to a trade show again. But there's that degree of, wow, all that stuff, it's nice to have, but none of it matters right now. It's all unessential. What matters is the conversations, basically, both, for the show, for the podcast, as well as with FDA and Congress and all the other groups I deal with. Right. It's, what boiled down is what matters is my brain and what I've picked up over the years. So yeah, I guess the inessential was the obviously inessential, those sorts of trappings. Where, what matters is the fact that I'm recording this in a room surrounded by about 3,000 books. And, if I had to be trapped anywhere, my library is a pretty goddamn good place to be trapped. So, yeah.
I guess now I can think of one thing that didn't seem to matter much. It's also teaching connected. But, when we first started, when the pandemic really hit hard and when we started to close down, that was over spring break. And we normally at St. John's after spring break, we have essay writing period for freshmen, sophomores, and juniors. So it worked out well for us because we just extended essay writing period and suspended classes for a bit longer. And I had a language tutorial. I offered to talk to students about the essays they were writing. And I found that those conversations, one-on-one conversations, were really not much worse off for not being in person. I like seeing people in person, but I think it was valuable for both me and for the student as a way of connecting. And, in a certain way, it's more relaxed. You can talk for longer because you're not all scheduled your time in the coffee shop, to 20-minute intervals with a whole stack of students coming by. So I think that that one-on-one contact, I think, is less hurt by the media, by the being forced to use telephone or Zoom or whatever. I think it's the groups more that are hurt, but the one-on-one does not.
Yeah. Who's the audience for Lost in Thought?
Well, I wanted to write it for as broad an audience as possible. So I wanted everyone to realize that learning mattered for its own sake, but I did also know that there were certain audiences that were more likely than others to pick it up and read it and get something out of it. I think there are really, in that sense, 2 kinds of audiences. One is an audience of academics who, for the most part, especially in the humanities, are a bit alienated from their work. They don't They don't always know what matters about it. Universities and colleges have become very bureaucratic, very automated in certain ways, very much administrated. Teaching has also become like that. And so part of my audience was people like that, so that they could get in touch with whatever it was that originally mattered to them. And then in this, I didn't know that we would have a massive crisis, but the universities have been in crisis for quite a long time anyway. I didn't know it would come this fast or be this dramatic. But I hoped that people could think about either how to reform the institutions that exist or how to build new ones according to the things that really mattered. So that was one audience. The other one, and I'm extremely happy, I knew that those people would, at least many of them would read it. What I didn't know, and what I'm very happy to see, is that I also wrote for people who you could roughly call autodidacts. That is, people out in the world who like to read, like to think about birds or plants. You know, they're amateur naturalists. They study science in their spare time, but they're not academic. They may not even have particularly gone far in formal education. And I wanted to communicate to those people that what they were doing was the real thing, that it was not some kind of watered down, not real because it wasn't connected to an academic institution, but that in a way, that kind of thing is more fundamental. The ordinary forms of learning for its own sake that happen in ordinary life are more fundamental than the professional versions. And that the profession really, in a way, exists in order to nurture that in the broader community. So anyway, I have heard from some autodidacts, so I know that they are reading it, and I'm extremely happy that that's happening and that they find it encouraging. So in between, I suppose there's also, these days, especially because the job market's been so bad for the past more than 10 years now, there are a lot of people who wanted to be academic but can't be. There's not enough work. And those people also have responded to the book very positively, and that's also a big part of my audience.
Yeah, I was worried reading the book that there was some sort of weird Tyler Durden, you were my insomniac alter ego thing when you were citing like the peregrine, the periodic table. Jonathan Rose, who I recorded a great podcast with for his book after the one you did, The Literary Churchill. I was reading it. I'm like, that can't be the same Jonathan. Holy crap, it is. Is she like stalking my library? This is amazing. So,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think of the peregrine as the pinnacle of exactly what you're talking about, not just in the autodidactic sense, but spinning gold out of this self-learned, self-observed world. It's to me one of the most phenomenal books I've ever read.
Oh, it's phenomenal, and the story behind it is phenomenal. And I'm glad that you've read it. That I thought was one of the more. I tried to throw in a lot of books because I wanted. I didn't want my book to be the last thing someone read. I'm still a St. John's tutor, right? So I wanted it to lead into more books, like the real books, not just books about books. The Peregrine, I thought, was one that would be a little bit less read. You know, Augustine's Confessions is very famous, but I'm delighted you've heard of it. I read it with some seniors for senior language and tried to persuade some other tutors to follow suit, but they were very skeptical. It was so recent and such a new book. And,
you just give them that preface chapter, the prologue, and it's just every sentence is a poem, and it's and conveying this greater world beyond it. It was turned on to me by a editorial cartoonist at formerly at the Washington Post, Matt Worker, who was one of my guests on the show, just mentioned it to me, and I thought, let me look that up. And then a review came out about it a few days later for the reissue by New York Review Books. And I thought, that sounds kind of interesting. And then my entire world changed. I read that and it was just, I see everything differently now. Oh my gosh, this is amazing.
No, I think I found out about it through reading an essay by Robert Macfarlane, who's a British academic who is interested in naturalism and the recovery of naturalism. And I was I was intrigued by the story of this office worker, who had never gone to university and had gotten so into birds. and also poetry. So he wanted to be a poet, and then he got interested in birds, and then this book comes out, which both are so intensely present. And I was just floored, as you were, by this book that I had never heard of, but that clearly needs to be more known than it is.
Yeah. We'll do our best. I've bought at least 20 copies to give away to people.
Thank you very much.
You may want to read this. Like, that's always my, and it varies. Like some people I know, I'm like, you wouldn't get this. One pal of mine who was a super very urban guy, just does not care about the natural world, etc. I thought, let me take a chance with Dimitri. And he wrote back, he's like, I have no interest in the subject matter. This is one of the most amazing books I've ever read. I'm like, good. Okay. You get that the writing and what's there, the way a world is being seen is more important than the particulars of the everything that he's chronicling in the mundane sense.
But it's
the idea that we have that world is just great. So go on.
No, the other reason why I think I wanted it to be included in the book is because, one of the responses to my earlier writing on the topic, where I talked at the beginning of the book about how I think intellectual life is something that's withdrawn from the world, that it cultivates an inner life. And I think people misunderstood what I meant by that initially. So they thought that I meant somehow you lock yourself in your closet and never looked at anything. And that wasn't at all what I meant. I meant something different. I meant the world in the sense of the realm of competition, the realm of ambition, the realm of struggling for power and for more money and for status and so on. But I very much wanted to include people who looked at the natural world in my images of intellectual life. So, and I just thought he was the perfect example of someone who connected with nature in such a profound and such an interesting way, and in a way that really drew on the older tradition of literature. There's so much Melville in that book. I mean, there's so much of Moby Dick.
Oh yeah.
And so much, and also so much of this literature that I've learned a little bit about since. There's a whole set of British raptor literature, literature about people with hawks, and he's also drawing on that. So it's
actually, it's a question that I know you address in the book, but how do you respond, I guess, to the notion of that sort of withdrawal is wonderful if you've got the resources to be able to do it? That sense that it's still, for the elite somehow. And I know it's something you sort of tackle, but can you go into that a little? Because I'm sure listeners who have not read the book are going to say that exact thing. Like, yeah, that's great, but I don't have the time to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I think that's another very common response I got to the early writing. And I think the important thing, this is one of the reasons why the Jonathan Rose book was so important to me and for my work. Mm-hmm. It's actually just not true that you need to be wealthy in order to think about things. So people who work with their hands, people who have intense laboring jobs, formed in the 19th and early 20th century organizations where they could read together. They read Plato and Kant and all kinds of stuff that's extremely difficult. And there are people now who are the same way, who are, they carve out time apart from their work. So it doesn't take money. Or you think about, what was the story I just read the other day? I'm reading this incredible book actually called Racecraft. It's an argument that there is no such thing as race, very powerfully argued by these two Black American women scholars. And in that book, there's a story that comes from their family. The two women are sisters, the two authors, where, the grandmother's great uncle, who had been a slave, was the slave to two boys who were sent off to Oxford to get some fine tuning on their manners. So they taught their slave, great Uncle Tom, Latin and Greek and Hebrew. And he, in turn, once he was back in the U.S., had a secret clandestine schoolhouse where he taught slaves Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. So I think, or even the story of Frederick Douglass, teaching himself to read and then doing it in this clandestine way and then reading all the great literature. So there's many, many stories in our history like this. And there are stories now, which if you open your eyes and think about them more clearly, I think you can see, one of our fellow alums wrote an essay recently about how well-educated and thoughtful many homeless people are, right? There's often autodidacts who have read absolutely everything. There was actually an obituary in the New York Times about a woman in New Haven who had died of COVID. But she had been homeless for many years. She was mentally ill in various ways, but she had been a very accomplished director of Shakespeare and a Shakespeare expert. So she would give these performances on the streets of New Haven of Shakespeare. So I think that it's just not true. And what really is true is that the big enemy is not low social status or poverty as such. It's partly overwork. So we do, there are circumstances where you're just working too much. Your life is too demanding. You just don't have any time to think. And poor people often are in those positions. But the real obstacle is for people like us, for middle class people, for relatively privileged people. It's something in us. It's that we don't really have the discipline to resist all of the things that distract us. It's very hard. Even me, I just wrote a book about how important reading is. I have not been able to read much in quarantine. I've been online a lot. And I recognize what the weakness is. I know where it comes from. I'm not too hard on myself about it, but it's a fact that these things compete with each other. We've become more distracted. Our attention spans are shorter, and it's harder for us to really think about something over a sustained period of time. That's much more, I think, grave an obstacle than money or high social status.
And where do you think academia actually became corrupt or fell into this really corrupt state that it's in? I mean, I could bring up that guy from 1989, but do you see roots, in terms of how you see it?
It's a great question. I didn't do a lot of historical diagnostic, partly because I don't feel like I quite know enough to say. And I also feel like I've read a lot of grand sweeping history of ideas sorts of accounts of things. And I'm never quite sure whether they're true or how to verify them. So yeah. I think part of me just resisted that approach. I do know that the post-industrial period, 19th century, early 20th century, that's the time when we have these working class grassroots movements for the humanities. And that's connected in a lot of ways with the labor movements. And that's connected with particularly extreme working conditions imposed by the robber barons and so on. So that's all something that has a specific historical frame. And then I think here in the U.S., the humanities really blossomed after the war, and the universities really blossomed after the war. We got this huge influx of refugees and immigrants from Europe. So sort of, the European universities in the early 20th century were incredible places for learning. And a lot of that came back to the U.S. We had all this money from having conquered the world, and everyone could afford to go to college, or not everyone, but most people could. So, and there was a sense, I think, partly because of the effect of the war and its horrors, there was a kind of contemplative spirit. There was a sense that we needed to figure things out and reflect in common. There was a greater, even when I was growing up or when you were growing up, I think, at least in my experience, I don't know if this was yours, there was a sense of intellectual humility. The Nazis were really pretty close to us. It was only 20, 30 years earlier. And the thought that these people who were supposedly civilized had done this was chastening. So I think the humanities were a big part, and the study of the great books were a big part of ways that people tried to grapple with what a human being was capable of, and tried to safeguard themselves from it. And I think part of what's happened is just the memory has faded of those events, so that humility has faded with it, and the sense of urgency of reflection. The economic situation in the U.S. and in the West in general has changed, and it's the middle class who grew so fast after the war, and who really were the people who flooded colleges and sought out learning, is a kind of more shrinking, embattled place to be, and people, it's middle class anxiety that makes the parents concerned about sending their kids off to study something like that. So that's just a few thoughts about what's changed. There's one more thing that I want to just say, even though I don't understand it very well, and that is that I've been trying to figure out what bureaucracy is and how it can function almost like a force of nature. That is, it feels to me like something which just creeps like ivy into institutions and rots them, honestly. There are good things that come with it. There are vices to institutions that are solely based on personnel. They can have kinds of unfairness and arbitrariness. But a bureaucratic institution can just in half a second get totally disconnected from its purposes and become a kind of wheel spinning, self-licking ice cream cone sort of thing. So I wish I knew. If you know, or if anyone you know has an understanding of how this happens, I would love to know.
I was going to say, you're actually the second St. John's grad on this show to use self-licking ice cream cone in the podcast. That's pretty impressive. The first one joined the Navy, and that's where he came out with that language. But yeah, bureaucracy, that's part of the. I don't know if it's human nature or if it's some perverse aspect thereof, but it's that sense of. Well, it's something you go into in the more personal aspects of the book, the competitive vibe you have within academia, where it's a zero-sum game in terms of, who's going to get the accolades and who's, going to get cut.
Right.
It happens on that managerial operational level too. As an example, there is a perverse misalignment of incentives in the world in which I operate for the most part, and that's pharmaceutical contract manufacturing. And that's companies that make drugs for the drug companies.
Yes.
The same way, you've like Princeton University has a printer who makes the book. My guys are the printers for.
Right. That too.
So they work with customers, and the customers are, the major drug companies as well as the little startups. And the biggest drug companies know the value of their product. They know, as one of my guys put it, we make something for them that we know that they're selling for $17,000 a vial. But no, that's not the funny part. The funny part is they're still trying to nickel and dime us on the cost of the vial. And that's because regardless of the rest of the institution, there's a guy in the procurement department. His incentive is to shave that nickel off the cost of the vial. Doesn't care about what impact that's going to have on quality of the product, the supply chain, anything else. Right. He's got a bonus that's tied into how do I shave pennies off of everything we're doing? And the way institutions build, that guy ends up getting a ridiculous amount of power, not wielding it maliciously. He's just doing his job as he knows it. And so when you get misaligned groups like that, I think you do find they entrench themselves. Generally, they tie into money and power, and it just becomes impossible to steer things sometimes. Yeah. One of the big accomplishments I pulled off in my job, we did this giant negotiation with the FDA this multi-billion-dollar thing, even though I had never negotiated a car price before this. But one of the things we came out with, it was absolutely nuts. I'm sitting there at the table thinking, thank God I went to St. John's, because I can learn everything that's here, but I shouldn't actually be in the room for this. But one of the things we settled on was that the FDA personnel now had to do time reporting, and they never were doing that previously. They would do reporting of like a 2-week sample every quarter, and that's how the FDA would extrapolate to productivity of their personnel.
Right.
And our guys on the private sector were like, go screw yourselves. We're giving you $500 million a year. You better be accountable for what you're doing with your time. And I met FDA people years after that negotiation who cursed our names because now they had to start punching in and, establishing what time they started stuff and didn't. And again, to a lot of us, that makes all the sense in the world. To them, it was like, no, this is how we've always done things. We have a bureaucracy in place, that knows how we work. Why should we have to report? So yeah, there's all sorts of tensions like that. I think anywhere you get management, it's not like The Office, but there is a sense of people become proprietary. Territory means something. Every win is a loss for someone else. So.
No, that seems right. No, that's very helpful. And it reminds me, I was talking about this with my best friend who lives outside of DC, who worked for a time she's a school teacher now, but she worked for a time at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And she kept finding mistakes in the way the data was analyzed in the reports that were coming out of her office. So she designed a checklist, make sure that you've done this before you publish the report. And, everyone just hated it, but it worked. And then she went on like a 2-week vacation. She came back. There were mistakes in the data. She said, what happened? Oh no, I didn't use the checklist. So, but you can imagine too that, if someone on the outside found a mistake in the data and demanded a change, that you would come up with some checklist, and maybe it wouldn't have been written by the person who really knew what they were doing and cared about data, but just someone who needed a checklist put in place. Yeah. So I can see the examples, and there's a wonderful book that came out last year called Bullshit Jobs. Have you seen this book?
No, I haven't.
It's by a sociologist in Britain named David Graeber. His analysis, I think, is not all right. Not completely correct. I disagreed with a lot of it, but the stories he gets. He wrote like an online essay about people who had jobs that just didn't make sense, but were very prestigious and well paid. And then from the online essay, he got hundreds of letters from all over the world from people who just worked in these absurd situations. Anyway, I highly recommend it. And
It just reminds me of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I don't know if you were that much of a nerd or not, but
my brother read it. We divided nerddom between my brother and I, and I lived vicariously through him. I think I did read it, but I don't remember it as well. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, there's an example where this planet of this people, much like humans, the elite enlightened people decide to get rid of all the bourgeois, including the telephone sanitizers, and just send them off to another planet, which ultimately becomes Earth, because this all happened millions of years ago. Right. And we learned in an aside that the original race unfortunately died from a communicable disease spread by telephones. And
yes, exactly. So it's somehow bureaucracy is tied into our good impulses to make things work better, and somehow or other it goes off, and
I think
it's caused
that's
a lot of damage to higher education. I know other institutions also, but a lot of damage to higher education.
Again, everybody could see it within their own silos, within their own frameworks, and seeing how it works in other people's lives. It's it can be sort of horrifying when you see the same sort of thing echoed in things that you thought were well managed because you weren't on the inside of those.
That's right.
But let me ask the same thing I ask every St. John's tutor I get, and I always blank on what the answer is. What would you put on the curriculum, and what would you remove to make space for it?
Well, where do I start?
It sounds like the Principia would go.
No, absolutely not. No. The Principia is a sacred text. The math curriculum is really fabulous, beyond changing.
It sounds like Ferrante would make it on based on
I have suggested it. I thought she's a little tough for us because it's 4 books, 4 novels, and we don't come to the space for it. But I did suggest it because I think it's such a terrific reflection on the post-war period and feminism, and brings us into sort of a more contemporary age. And I really do think it's just they're incredible novels. But let's see. The thing I last complained about was I thought we should, the way we have our American readings now, we have some at the end of junior year, so we have Locke, because we do all this, we do Rousseau and Locke, and we've done Hobbes, and then we read the constitutional papers, Federalist Papers, and then we read Huck Finn. And I've gotten very interested in Frederick Douglass, as I mentioned him earlier. I thought he would go great in there. We have a lot of Black American literature and stories and history in the second semester of senior year, where we do Lincoln and we have Du Bois and all these characters. But I wanted some of it moved back. That's a kind of more minor thing. The real thing I want is we have freshman year in ancient Greece, and we have the Enlightenment in junior year, and then the 1,000 years in between are packed into sophomore seminar, where we, by spring break, it's already the Renaissance. So we get ancient Rome, the Hebrew Bible, the ancient Rome, the New Testament, all of Christianity, and then the Renaissance. So I want more biblical readings, more medieval readings. I'd love us to read some of the Islamic Golden Age, Maimonides, and that's the hard thing about that is, what do you take off? Because to do something like that, you really have to remake the whole seminar curriculum. So, for instance, you have to get rid of junior year preceptorials. I think that's what you'd have to do. So you get rid of junior preceptorials, move all that stuff at the end of sophomore year up, and then have a sophomore year where you really delve into different kinds of, delve into the other parts of the Christian tradition and other religious traditions. So that's my most radical thought about the program, to really just chew it up. But
yeah, because everything is, as every tutor has said, the time is fixed.
Exactly.
There's only so much time, and they all have I guess you'd have to move this, and you'd have to drop that, and
it is always. I have a lot of conversation with alumni, partly because I like them a lot, and partly because I know a lot because they're my friends, and I volunteer in the alumni office a lot. They always, every alum has why don't we read? But they never have an answer to the other part of the question. And our current students too, there's tons more things they want to read. But that's never been the difficulty. It's, what do you want to get rid of? That's the hard question. Because, it's that we get very few complaints about things which we actually do read. What we get is, why didn't we do more? And it's like, well, that's what the rest of your life is for, kids. Come on. We never claim to be a complete curriculum. It's just a starter. It's just like the sourdough starter you add the rest of your life to, and make something new out of it.
And now that you've been there 5 years or so?
That's right.
Is 18 too young to start there or not? And again, I came in at 22 and I only did the GI, which I understand does not hold a candle to the undergrad experience. I just don't think I would have handled it at 18. And I wonder, from someone who did it and someone who's taught students or worked with students, what's your take?
I definitely, because I haven't spent much time in the GI since I came back, but I've advised a few essays, and I also taught in the GI when I was at UMBC. I filled in when they needed people, and I think it's wonderful. I think the GI is essential because you get these students who know exactly why they're there. They know why it matters. They've studied other places. They know how special it is. They're older. They've got more life experience. it's just terrific. And in a way, I've done community seminars, which is often full of GI alums. And I think to myself, well, this is what we're supposed to be doing. It's helping adults do the learning that they've always wanted to do. So on the one hand, I feel the pull of that. On the other hand, it's something different for undergrads. They don't always appreciate it. They almost never take full advantage of it. But something about the experience changes them. And that was true for me. So for instance, I did hardly any work my first 2 years at St. John's. I tell my students this sometimes. They don't believe me, but it's true. And my colleagues. But it's true. I was on the quad drinking beer. I was not doing, my Apollonius proofs. But it's still being a part of that community mattered. And it really is, in a way, what I try to capture in the book, and that it's just a different place than other places. It has a different set of values, and you don't want the rest of the world to be exactly like that. That would be strange, and that would be weird and insular, and so on. But I think it changes the way that you interact with the world. I have an example about that, actually. I've just been thinking about it. I was at a lecture. It was right around the time I came back, maybe even before I came back to be a tutor. I came in for a lecture by a tutor who had also been a student with me. And the lecture was on Kant on music. So about as abstruse a topic as you could get trying to lecture. And these two classmates of the tutor and people who I had also been in school with came in. They drove in together from DC. Now, one was high-ranking Republican staffer on Capitol Hill. The other was very, very liberal Democrat, human rights lobbyist, also worked at Capitol Hill. So these two people, opposite ends of this political spectrum, they got in an Uber together, or however it was they did it. They came out to this lecture on Kant on music. They loved it. They loved it. They went the question period. They wanted to talk about it. And I thought to myself, well, this is what we want for our students. We want them to have some part of themselves that's not just eaten up by something like Capitol Hill or Wall Street or whatever it is, or the pharmaceutical industry or whatever it is. So, and I do think that works, even though they're 18 years old and even though in many ways they're too immature. It's an age which is very formative, and it does what it's supposed to do. I don't know if I'd want it any other way.
Understood. I'm coming at it from someone who got there a few years later, interacted with the undergrads. Again, I did Hampshire College for my undergrad, and I have the same suspicion about that tells me, Gil, maybe it was you and not these two institutions.
Oh no, I don't. I'm not disagreeing with you. I hope it's clear. There are things that 18-year-olds do not get out of the. Sure. It can be painful to be in an Iliad seminar or a Thucydides seminar, partly because I think young people don't realize that these books are real. That Thucydides, he was right. Like what he's writing about was what he lived through. And if you read it, they think of it as being something intellectual. They don't understand that books are about life, which older students do understand. So they're missing something, and they're often too immature to work very hard. I'm just saying that something different happens, which is as important as what happens for grads. And in a certain way more important in that we, I think people change from being at St. John's. And I wonder, you can tell me whether this seems true. I wonder whether GIs they come because they're already a bit like that. I don't know. Does that seem true to you? Or do you think it's transformative for the GIs as well? It was
the most important 2 years of my life. Wow. I look back, I'm going to be 50 in January, and the most important years were 93 to 95.
Wow.
Because I learned how to learn. And, on top of that, the social situation, the basketball, the girls, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. But and we won't go into whether you remember anything horrible about me from that period that we overlapped.
I don't, and I'm sure you don't remember
God.
anything about me. There's a pact that we get
Yeah,
into.
good. It's Fight Club except with great books. So, it's to me it was incredibly important. But again, I was 23, 24.
Right.
Then we had the middle, we'll say the middle-aged housewives. We had older people coming. So we had a mix, and it was the same thing in my undergrad life. We had a guy who came to Hampshire. He was about 9 or 10 years older than me. And he came in and he valued every minute he was there because he'd been in the working world. He'd done all sorts of other shit in his life. And he got I have an opportunity here. I'm really going to take it. And with the GI, I think we had that, I think some people were more secure in their domestic lives.
Yeah.
But there was a sense where, again, we cared and the books really mattered. But we didn't have as deep an immersive experience as you guys have as undergrads. And again, it's not self-deprecating. It's just blankly there. We didn't have the language stuff, et cetera. So.
Well, I think that they're two different programs, and I think they're both really important. The one group of undergrads I would say that are most like the GIs in terms of their maturity and in terms of their enthusiasm are, we've been getting a steady stream of veterans who come on the GI Bill. They're often older. They've had sometimes extremely gritty or traumatic life experiences, and they just love, they're just all there in a way that the kids,
they're going to read the Iliad a lot differently than
exactly. Well, they read the Iliad, they'll read the Thucydides, they'll read everything much differently.
Yeah,
So, I'm grateful. And we have now I don't know exactly how old she is. It's not polite to ask, but there's a woman who is an adult. She is older than me, and she entered as a freshman 2 years ago. So she'll be a junior in the fall. She's an artist, and lived in New York. And she told me, I talked to her a bit at Convocation when she first came. And she said, well, I knew this was what I needed to do for my work, for her artistic work. And she's just flourished. She takes care of the kids. Sometimes need an adult. She's at every question period, every lecture, just soaking it up. So anyway.
I don't think I ever encountered that in the undergrad side, but that's fantastic. Now, lightning round questions. My brother, I don't know my brother was Boaz Roth.
That's right. I think I knew him a bit better than you, because I think he was dating someone who was a classmate of mine.
Carrie.
That's right.
But so lightning round from Bo, Iliad or Odyssey?
Iliad.
Bleak House or Middlemarch?
Ooh. That's hard. I have to choose one.
What was the taskmaster? Yeah. Just preference. Yeah.
Middlemarch.
Dostoevsky or Tolstoy?
Dostoevsky.
Oh, yeah, the religious thing. I'm just kidding.
No, I don't know what it is. It's actually there's a little bit of negative on Tolstoy as well as a bit of a positive on Dostoevsky there. So, but Dostoevsky's the one I connect with for sure.
Is there a book that speaks more to you now than when you read it at St. John's, and something that speaks less, something that you valued a lot at St. John's but doesn't mean as much to you now?
Great question. I know I was already talking about it, but I think Thucydides, most of the books, truthfully, I appreciate much more now than I did when I was a student. So I'm the Hebrew Bible. That was something I did not like as a student and did not understand. It's now one of my favorite things. Thucydides, I thought, was quite boring and dense and kind of melodramatic. Now I think about it all the time. It's part of the framework of how I see the world is Thucydides. So those are easy to come by. And I've loved the math curriculum, which I don't think was my favorite part when I was a student. it's changed the way I think about things and so on. In terms of the other end of the question, is there something I really mattered to me as a student that matters less to me now? This isn't a specific work, but it's something that has changed. When I was a student, I think I was a very typical St. John's undergrad in this respect, that I wanted my literature to tell me something. I liked literature that was about ideas. And I still like literature about ideas, but I definitely over the years have come to appreciate that literature is also doing something different. It's not just philosophy in story form. It's connecting to a whole other dimensions of human experience. Poetry especially is closer to music in many ways than it is to, say, epigrams or proverbs. So I think that dimension of the books and of intellectual life in general is something which has changed for me over the years. And I think that also affects a bit my taste in literature. So yeah, even Middlemarch, one of the reasons why I hesitated, Middlemarch is a bit didactic. She tells you, this is what you should think about this character and that character and that character. I mean, it's beautiful. It's a wonderful book. But that gets older to me. Whereas someone like Jane Austen, who, is just so austere and so human and so interested in certain kinds of reality, that I think never really gets old. So anyway, that's I think pretty good for that question. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. But, yeah.
Closing question, and we only have about 30 seconds. Okay. So again, what is virtue and can it be taught?
Here's what I think. It's actually I'm writing another book sometime, not immediately, but soon. And one of the things I will talk about is how virtue, or our moral condition, as I talk about it, it's real, it's important, it's not imaginary, but it's very, very difficult to attain and to preserve it once you have it. So that's a sort of promise of an answer to a question to be fulfilled more thoroughly at a later time.
I look forward to the next book. Is it okay if I call you Zena, or should I say Ms. Hitz?
You absolutely can call me Zena. You're a distinguished alum of the college, and first names with a diploma comes a first name license. So please.
I still call them Mr. May and Mr. Townsend. I still can't get over it. But
all right.
But Zena, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate the time.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Pleasure talking to you. Always a pleasure to talk to Johnny's about the old homestead. So thanks so much for staying interested in what we do.
And that was Zena Hitz. Go read Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life from Princeton University Press. Just came out this year. It really is a joy and a book to bring us back to ourselves. You can find it at better bookstores or through Princeton University Press's website. Now, you can check out more of Zena's writing, along with reviews of Lost in Thought, interviews, and her scholarship at her website, zenahitz.net, which is ZenaHitz.net. She's on Twitter as Zena Hitz, spelled the same way, all one word. And you can learn more about St. John's College and its Great Books program, which, as we talked about during the conversation, changed my life, at sjc.edu. And all of these links will be in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, in the before time, this is when I would mention my Patreon and PayPal and how I'd appreciate your support for the show. But while I do appreciate your support in terms of emails, letters, postcards, etc., we are living in a different world now. My job is taking care of me just fine. My finances are okay. So if you can spare anything, don't give it to me. give it to people who are in need. There are artists and writers out there and other creative people. There are non-creative people. Go find their Patreons, Kickstarters, GoFundMes, Indiegogos, tip jars, whatever it is, and show them some support. If you're not comfortable giving to individuals, there are plenty of charities in need right now related specifically to the pandemic, as well as the freedom funds, bail funds, attorneys' fees, healthcare funds, etc., for people who are, for people who were flexing their right to peaceful protest and found themselves in a bad situation with police. So you should look into those, see how you can contribute, and how you can make a difference. There are a lot of people and causes who can use a hand right now, so if you're in a position to help, then help. And to get back to the egotistical thing at the top of the episode, if you're interested in a copy of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and hit me up that way. It's free, but you can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want. This is not a money-making idea for me. Like I said, my job treats me perfectly well. This is about sharing my art, such as it is. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.